In Syria, old foes become fast friends. As a new phase in the war unfolds, the players might be the same, but suddenly the sides they're playing for aren't. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the YPG's deal with Damascus. In northern Syria, alliances seem to shift more swiftly than the sand. The concept of keeping enemies closer than friends might be good advice, except it's not always clear who's who. Once American allies in the fight against Daesh, the YPG says they were stabbed in the back by Washington's withdrawal. They've turned to Assad and his regime, the forces responsible for the majority of Syria's more than 400,000 deaths. Now Russia stepped in to prevent a direct confrontation between the regime and Turkish troops. Whether as power broker or peacemaker, will Moscow's involvement redraw the war's boundaries and loosen the bonds between nations that could bring peace? Haider Abbasi has more.
This is YPG-held territory, and these are Syrian regime soldiers being welcomed back. They haven't been in Manbij since they lost control of the city in 2012. The YPG turned to Syria's Bashar al-Assad in desperation. In a few days, Turkey's army and Syrian opposition fighters have forced out the YPG from towns and villages it once held. Ankara says the terror group is a threat to its national security and wants to create what it calls a safe zone here, stretching 120 kilometers wide and 32 kilometers deep. Ankara says there's no room in this corridor for the YPG, but the return of Assad's army to Manbij complicates things for Turkey. The northern city falls within Ankara's proposed safe zone, and Syria's regime has a powerful ally, Russia. President Vladimir Putin wants to prevent a conflict between Assad and Ankara. Russian soldiers are now patrolling the outskirts of Manbij, but Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he won't stop the campaign.
Bizim zaten yani özellikle Manbij'te olmak diye bir derdimiz yok. Bizim tek derdimiz var. O da şudur. Ama Rusya ama rejim buradan terör örgütü YPG'yi, PYD'yi buradan çıkarmalarıdır.
The return of the regime in northern Syria follows the US decision to withdraw troops from the region. Since 2017, American soldiers have been patrolling Manbij and other areas, but that void has now been filled by Russia. So will the deal with the YPG help the Assad regime recapture more lost territory? And does this allow Russia to further extend its influence in Syria and the region? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, to look at how one or both of those scenarios could play out, let's go to our guests. In Washington, D.C. is former Syrian diplomat Bassam Barabandi. He's also the co-founder of the Syrian opposition group People Demand Change. Murat Aslan is in Akçakale, near Turkey's border with Syria. He led the intelligence division of the Turkish armed forces and is now a security researcher at the SETA Foundation. In London is Ammar Waqqaf, the founder and director of Gnosos, a think tank focusing on the Middle East and Syria. And here with me in the studio is Jasmine el Gamal, a former Middle East advisor at the US Defense Department. Good to have you all on the program. Bassam Barabandi, let me start with you. So the YPG reaching out to Assad, I guess in desperation, and he was probably gleeful in accepting to be a part of this. Did you expect it to happen?
Yeah, I mean, the connection or communication between YPG and PKK with Assad regime didn't stop, according to their leaders, at least for the last 3 years. PKK, PYG, till today, they are selling oil for the Assad regime for the last 2 years. So the communication is always there. But what surprised me, literally, is how they have miscalculations. How can they trust the Assad regime who humiliated the Kurds, Syrian Kurds, for the last 60 years? And they trusted him just like this to say, you will be our savior against Turkey. Okay. They have major problem in understanding the real world. President Trump was very clear since last year that he will withdraw the arms, U.S. forces from Syria. Turkish government was very clear from day one that they will never allow PKK control area inside Syria. Russia was very clear from day one that Assad regime should re-control all over Syria. So if you put this basic information, basic equation, you can find that the best thing for the Kurds is to negotiate with Turkey, not with the Assad regime, benefiting from the support they had or they have from the US and Western governments. What they did is exactly they miscalculate everything. They are dealing with Assad regime now. The regime forces are on the northern border of Syria. Assad will never respect the Kurds. He did never. From 1963 till 2001, we have more than 500,000 Kurdish without ID. The government or the regime doesn't consider them as a human. I don't know how they make that final conclusion that this kind of regime will be better than the Turkey.
Right.
When we look about the Kurdish Turkey, for example, just give me 1 minute. Turkish Kurdish, they at least they have an ID. They go to school. They go to the government. They are member of parliament. They may be asking for more demands than their rights, but still they have more than basic. So dealing with Turkey, benefiting from again U.S. Western support, they will get much better deal. But unfortunately for all Syrian now, it's not only for them that we lost that golden opportunity to empower all Syrian opposition. Any lands gained by the regime is losing for the people.
Okay, let's go to Murat Aslan.
So
Murat Aslan, there's a slight delay with you on the border as well. So just so everybody knows, we can factor that in if the conversation gets a little slow and sticky sometimes. Murat Aslan, Turkey has a clear vision of what it wants to do in establishing this peace corridor. But as is always the case, these things cook up a lot of other variables as conflict begins, right? So now that the YPG has reached out to Assad, Damascus is on board, the Russians are supporting them. Tactically in the battlefield, does this give the Turkish state a whole lot of problems?
Well, Turkey is focusing on the ultimate goal because Turkey has clearly announced at the very beginning of the operation that Turkey wants to further establish a border security to clear the terrorist cells very close to the border, in the vicinity of the border, and also establish a zone for Syrians that had to, immigrate to Turkey as refugees. So once Turkey started this operation, there was a great strategic slide on the ground, which means alliances were rechecked, balances were reconsidered, and Turkey has to, balance itself with Russia, the United States, and regime did the same thing along with YPG. YPG's concern is to have a kind of protectorate by means of regime. Somebody must protect them because the operation has indicated that they are not that much stronger to protect themselves in the region. That means their capacity is limited. So if regime accepts it and currently accepts it, then it's a new reality. So Turkey must act in comparison to the previous term. Turkey is not concerned what regime is doing, but if YPG enjoys a security and starts to commit attacks to Turkish territory. So if it is prevented by means of regime and Russia, not the United States, because the United States lost the ground, then Turkey is happy, no problem. But currently, the only concern is to have security for Turkey for the coming 4 decades in comparison to the insecure 4 decades before.
Jasmine el Gamal, when we look at it, the Russians and the regime are filling the gaps, I guess, that were left behind by the Americans, and things are moving quite fast. Are you worried about where things are going?
I am. I think we should all be worried about where things are going. And I think that, to me, one of the most tragic things about this whole situation is how preventable it was, how incredibly preventable it was, and how it was aggravated by a U.S. president who doesn't seem to understand the inner workings of American diplomacy. We should be worried about where things are going because it's very unclear where the Americans stand at the moment. It's unclear how far the Turks are going to go inside of Syria. It's unclear what the deal between the SDF and the regime will look like. And it's unclear how far the regime will want to go throughout the Northeast in order to regain control over its territory. There are an incredible amount of unknowns in the situation, and it's very hard to see where this might be going over the next even just week or two.
Ammar Waqqaf, Bashar al-Assad had promised to retake every inch that he had lost. since this war began. Is this another example of him retaking a few more inches?
Yeah, I think in general, any territory that goes back under the Syrian government control and goes back to normality, as defined by Damascus, is basically a gain. I would like to contest two ideas that came along.
Go for it.
If I may. First of all, this is not a surprising deal. During the Euphrates Shield and the Olive Branch operations in 2017, 2018 respectively, which are pretty much similar to the current one, there was interdependence, assistance between the Syrian army and Kurdish forces, just like what we see today. There was land also ceded to the Syrian army, and the common objective between these two parties was to halt the Turkish-backed advance, Turkish-backed incursion, and it happened during the Manbij area, near the Manbij area, for example, or in Tel Rifat in the Olive Branch. So it's not surprising. What is surprising, perhaps, is that there is an announcement now that there was a meeting facilitated by the Russians, and there was an agreement of some sort. But what we're seeing on the ground is pretty much what happened over there in western of the Euphrates plateau, but albeit in a larger space. The second point I would like to contest is that President Trump, there's the easy accusation that he doesn't know what to do and he doesn't understand and blah, blah, blah. But for him, perhaps this was a rational decision to reduce American footprint in areas where it doesn't concern America much. What the United States may be focused on at this moment in time is to keep pressure on the Syrian government by maintaining the Syrian army away
Ammar,
from
if you'd allow me, right, for a second. Wouldn't you forgive people for being a bit confused if Trump says, I might destroy your economy, I'm going to impose sanctions, which he does, and then, I don't know, 48 hours later, he goes, I don't even care. Actually, the PKK is worse than ISIS. People are wondering, what the hell does he think? We don't even know. Then what's the point of the sanctions?
He's definitely producing statements left, right and center. What we understand is that there is I wouldn't say agreement, but at least a coordination between Russia and the United States on where and how much a Turkish-backed incursion might happen. So once it reached its limits, like 30 kilometers south, we've started hearing voices from Russia and America at the same time, pushing Turkey towards stopping and halting this offensive. And this happened yesterday. And by the way, there was this letter that was leaked. Right. And the Turkish president yesterday touched on that when he said, we are advised by some of our allies to sit down with the terrorists. If they want to do it, we don't want to do it. But obviously there is the Americans, the way we see it, the Americans allowed this to happen to a certain extent, but then they would like to say, we pressurized Turkey and now they're stopping, look how great we are.
Okay. Jasmine, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to, there's a point that I think we should touch upon. I think it's a really important point because both Ammar and Bassam made a point that I agree with, which is none of these decisions in themselves by the US president to withdraw are surprising. In fact, Trump has never been clear on anything more than the fact that he has wanted US troops out of the Middle East and out of Syria. It was a campaign promise. He constantly repeated it. He was constantly frustrated with his advisors who were trying to get him to delay the withdrawal. So this was definitely not a surprise in the sense that we always knew that US was leaving Syria at some point. In that sense, the criticism against the SDF that they should have been planning for this from day one and shouldn't have been caught so flat-footed is fair. However, I want to make the distinction between the decision to withdraw and the way that the diplomacy has been carried out and the way that the decision has been carried out. So traditionally, a diplomatic initiative is cleared by and coordinated throughout the US government, across departments and agencies to ensure there's a holistic strategy. It's coordinated with our allies. We give them plenty of notice to tell them what we're about to do and how. And it's coordinated with folks on the ground who are going to be affected by our decision. None of that has happened. And I think that's why the criticism against President Trump is so valid. And that's why the SDF has been caught so flat-footed, not because they didn't know that we were going to withdraw, but because every day it seemed that there was a different decision and a different thing going on.
Yeah, and we're going to talk with more depth or in more depth about that letter tomorrow, the one on October the 9th, which for a lot of people was only lacking emojis, right? I mean, a lot of people, upon first reading, they couldn't believe that this was real, right? I want to go to Bassam, and I want to pose to you what President Erdogan said about the regime's entrance to Manbij, and of course the Russian special forces are around as well. He said, the regime's entrance to Manbij is not very negative for me. In the end, this is their own land, but what is important to me is that the terrorist organization should not remain there. I mean, what we ask is whether the YPG PYD will remain there. I told Mr. Putin as well, if you clear Manbij of the terrorist organizations, either you or the regime can do it by providing all the logistics. But if you say you won't do it in that way, the tribes over there are calling for us to save them, because almost all of Manbij, 85 to 90% of it, belongs to Arabs, not Kurds. Bassam, as somebody who's in the Syrian opposition, has been against Assad during all these years, 8 years or so, is that the clearest indication yet that Turkey is putting its priority on fighting terrorism and defending its border? And ultimately, we're at a point where, listen, Syria can be Assad's and can be Putin's, but that's not our fight right now.
Look, most of the Syrian, they have confusion when it comes to Turkey. They have too much emotional attached to Turkey, to President Erdogan himself. He hosted a lot of refugees and so on and so forth. Everything is known. At the same time, sometimes they misinterpret Turkey. Turkey is not banana republic. Turkey is not a country open charities. Turkey has its own interest in the region. It has interest to protect its own national security issues. Personally, I'm not with the Turkish invasion to Syria. I don't think this is the right way, because I see where the consequences could happen. The regime will take over, Russia will take over, the United States will leave. So all this doesn't benefit us. Unfortunately, most of the Syrian opposition, they just endorse whatever Turkey is doing without thinking, without asking. And I think this is what makes all the political leadership, if we call leadership of the opposition, don't have legitimacy. They don't have the vision. They scare from Turkey. Whereas myself, whenever I meet any Turkish officials in DC or New York, I always tell them what I think.
I see.
And I don't feel that they are against it.
And you have a Turkish official on this program.
I think today the big picture...
Yeah, give me a second here, because there's an opportunity for direct communication with a Turkish official here. Yeah. So, Murat Aslan, something that's interesting here is Bassam was contextualizing sympathetically towards the Turkish position, especially on national security. But as a member of the Syrian opposition to Assad, he used the word invasion. He said Turkish invasion of northern Syria. Tell me why the Turkish state disagrees with that characterization of it.
Well, invasion is a bit tough word for that, because Turkey started this operation in accordance with the 51st article of the UN agreement. Because what Turkey is concerned is, first, a prerequisite of being a state, because Turkey must provide security for their own citizens. And second, we have a refugee population in Turkey, almost 5 million people. And Turkey, as a responsible state, as accepted in international relations, international politics, must act to encourage these people enjoy their country and establish a life over there. On the other hand, there's one reality. Turkey is very stick to the Astana process. And Turkey has recognized the unity of Syria in Astana, in Sochi, in Tehran, and also in Ankara. So Turkey is not concerned with the unity of Syria, but concerned with the political process that has to be started nowadays in accordance with the Geneva process. If Geneva process runs, then Turkey is happy, no problem, because once a democratic Syria is built here, then Turkey is happy. There will be no problem then. So the issue is not invasion, but take adequate measures to prevent threats that is imminent for Turkey.
Jasmine el Gamal, give me the best case scenario for you. Show me how this ends well.
Okay, I think that, I'm glad you asked that question, because I don't think it's very helpful to just criticize and criticize without offering some sort of recommendation or some sort of way forward. So thanks for asking that. I think that if we just take a step back and look at the parties to the conflict right now, It is really important for the U.S., I'm going to speak from a U.S. perspective, but also just from anyone's perspective, to recognize that each one of these actors has legitimate and valid security concerns. It would be a huge mistake not to take those concerns into account because these actors are the ones living in the region. Turkey has legitimate security concerns on its border. It has a huge refugee population that it needs help with, and it is trying to achieve those objectives of a safe and secure border. So that's something that we need to acknowledge. The SDF likewise has been an ally. They've helped us defeat ISIS, and they deserve to be supported in the sense of what they want to achieve. My best case scenario would be for the US to get back in the game diplomatically, to forget all of these theatrics and the letters and the tweets, return to quiet diplomacy. I think the trip by Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo is a good step. Unfortunately, it was undermined by the letter. However, it's still a good step. The Turkish president still has an invitation to come to Washington later this year. He's going to Russia on the 22nd of October. This is an opportunity for actors to get back on the table and to address all of these security concerns. Two other things that I'll address. So besides the US getting back into the game, trying to get Turkey and the SDF back onto the negotiating table, and refraining from any more theatrics, it's really important to focus on the potential danger of ISIS prisoners escaping from the prisons that they're in Syria right now. That should be a priority for the negotiators to deal with. We need to make sure that the SDF has the capacity that it needs to continue maintaining control over those prisons. And the same thing goes for Al-Hol camp, of course, with the 70,000 women and children there. And then lastly, the 230 civilians that have had to flee over the last week because of the Turkish action in Syria. We need to make sure that those people have tents, they have camps, they have urgent medical care, and everything that they need to survive until this conflict is dealt with through diplomacy.
Ammar Waqqaf, as we circle this back to the beginning, to the very deal that started this discussion, the YPG reaching out to Bashar al-Assad. So a lot of people saying, well, the YPG probably, they feel under threat. This is tactical. This is desperate. But the Baathists are going to eat you alive once they're done helping you. And that's it for the YPG. Never mind autonomy. Never mind your stateless in the northeast. Assad will finish you up and spit you out by the end of it. Is that how you see it?
No, I think basically these are Syrian citizens. The official language coming out from Damascus is that they've lost the way or lost path or whatever. I think what they're concerned about, and I sat with them, we've had discussions and work groups and what have you, they are concerned, they have certain demands about their culture, their language and whatever, and they're currently cooperating with the Americans in order to put pressure on Damascus to achieve at the end of the day, say, whatever this conflict ends, hopefully soon, certain achievements, certain goals. Now, the Damascus isn't very happy with the fact that they've put all their eggs in the American basket, and sometimes I've listened to your guests, sometimes we think of them, the Kurdish militia, the SDF, YPG, PYD, whatever, we think of them as independent, rational players, but we need to understand that probably they're not. They probably put all their eggs in the American basket and they cannot control what happens. Hence, probably their frustration from the Americans' latest withdrawal.
Right.
I need also to touch on the point of how Damascus views this. We've just heard from the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad that they are going to do whatever it takes to bring back that land that is being now pushed into by Turkish-backed militia into Syrian government control. And as a final point, I disagree with Mr. Bassam in Washington, in America. Not all Syrians hold dear, I have to say the hard truth, sorry, not all Syrians hold dear whatever the Turkish government and President Erdogan did in Syria in the past 8 years.
Bassam Barabandi, there's a minute left on the program and we are live, so I'm going to ask you to be extremely brief. Final word from you, sir. Wrap us up.
Final word. Again, Turkey is not banana republic. The concern is very clear from day one. I blame the leaders of PKK or PYD, whatever you call them, for misjudgment. They just hijack all the Kurdish community in Syria, and they just give them back to the regime for nonsense. I don't believe there will be any good ending for this crisis, the short one that we are living, or the Syria crisis as a whole. Till today, the regime TV from Kamishli is accusing PKK to be or SDF to be a terrorist group from today. So I don't see there will be any end results for whatever. The regime can claim whatever it wants to claim, but at the end of the day, it's about the big deal, Russian, Turkey, and United States, how to divide. And finally, the United States government, when they talk with SDF, they coordinate with them militarily. They didn't coordinate with them politically.
Okay,
so the SDF at that time, he had communication with Iran, with Turkey, with Russia, and with the regime, and they pick up their choices, not the American who tell them what to do.
Okay, Bassam, Jasmine, Murat Aslan, and Ammar Waqqaf, been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.